Our speaker today served from 1976 to 1994 as the third dean of the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. He was dean when I was an undergraduate, so he was my dean there. Ralph Lowenstein, I think the thing that, in addition to an amazing life, awards, service in wars, I think the thing that, as a journalist, he's really known for is as a real visionary in the 1970s as to what was coming down the road. In 1971, he co-authored a book called Media, Messages, and Men that predicted, and think about it, in 1971, we didn't even have PCs. We certainly didn't have cell phones. I was 11 years old, and you were not even. But he predicted what the book called the personal retrieval stage of media, in which people could go and get unlimited amounts of information and news from centralized computers, which sounds a whole lot like what we do today with the internet. And so when I first arrived as an undergraduate at the University of Florida, there on the TVs in the college, they were running text across the TV. And we all sort of looked at it and said, what's that? We have newspapers. They'll be here forever. I think the favorite line at that time was, people are always going to want to sit on the bathroom toilet and read a newspaper. You know, have the newspaper. Well, we were wrong, and we continue to be wrong. And so one of the challenges that I put to you, and that you can certainly talk to Dean Lowenstein about, is his ability to look 40 years into the future. You've got to look 40 years into your future and figure out, if this is what's going on now, what happens next. And so to talk to you about that and a lot of his experiences, here's Dean Ralph Lowenstein.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. I haven't been in a classroom in many, many years. I do speak frequently, but not to students, and I'm sorry to say. And I miss that association because I was in journalism education for some 40 years. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years and an administrator for 20 years, and it was always a great experience for me. And looking at that refrigerator over there with photographic film, I asked Professor Garcia if they're still using film around here. Maybe it's left over as a memento of other days, but it reminds me, in the first job I got at the University of Texas at El Paso, I had been a reporter photographer for the El Paso Times. And I went up there first part-time and then full-time, but also teaching photography, among many other things that I had to teach. It was only a 3-person department, and so I had about 8 different preparations a year. One of them was photojournalism, and I had to build the photo labs. There were no photo labs around, sinks and whatever. And they said, well, we used to teach photography at one time here, and there's a closet over there. And it was a lock on this little closet about the size where that clock is there. And I opened it up, and there was just nothing in there. But there was one instrument that looked sort of like this. It was a T. It was a T, and it had a spring on it, and there was a box of bullets next to it. And the bullets were blanks. I mean, there was no bullet in it as such, but it was a shell with it was marked blank bullets. In this instrument, you put a bullet into the instrument, in the bottom of the instrument, and it had a trigger on it, and the top was flat, and you poured photographic powder, gunpowder, I don't know what, on the top of it. And when you took a picture, you pulled the trigger, the bullet exploded, ignited the powder, and lit up the room. This thing was invented, this thing was there before photo bulbs, you know, which I grew up using. I mean, it was incredible, and I curse myself once a year anyway, the fact that I didn't save that thing and maybe show it to people today to show how primitive things were and how much they have changed just in a fairly short period of time. My mother was born only a few years after General Custer fought the Battle of Bighorn. Got that. Bighorn. My grandfather settled in Danville, Virginia, my hometown, at the urging of a Confederate captain, a former captain in the Confederate Army. And it looks like the war between the states, the Civil War, the Battle of the Bighorn was 1,000 years ago, but some of it happened in my lifetime. And the changes in newspapers especially happened during my lifetime. It's incredible to look back at it today, but I'm 87 years old, okay? So I was born in 1930, just at the beginning of the Depression, but every small town in the United States and city had at least two newspapers. Almost all had two newspapers, and some had, my freshman year at Columbia University, there were 10 newspapers in the city of New York in those days, 10 different daily newspapers. And today, you know, the newspapers are in demise. There are very few that had cities that have the size of my hometown that have two newspapers anymore. And so I always thought that the electronic newspaper was going to take over that role. And it's surprising, very surprising, that over all these years that we've had electronic newspapers, that they still haven't taken off and gone anywhere, especially, I mean, we're reading newspapers that way, but it isn't a complete newspaper. There very few have any advertising, real advertising. And this is what I want to talk to you, and hope you will discuss it with me. I had planned to speak about that subject of the electronic newspaper at the beginning of this talk, and the next class session to continue that, but also that the next class session I want to speak about the visit of Richard Spencer to Gainesville, Florida last week, because it's so much a part of our lives and part of the discussion of press freedom that I thought it would be worth passing that information on to you and discussing that with the students who were here also. The newspaper in my youth and later was a real gatekeeper for the people in that community, for that part of this, whatever part of the state it was. And I talked about the death of the gatekeeper. But a gatekeeper is somebody, an editor usually, who determines what goes into the newspaper and what doesn't go into the newspaper. That he or she sits there making that decision for all the readers to determine what is the news of the day and what isn't the news of the day. And it seems to me that we are seeing the death of the gatekeeper. Everybody now is a newspaper publisher. They go into Facebook and they have their say. There's no gatekeeper between them and anybody else. They are publishers. People publish their own books. I received a book last week from a guy who had been corresponding with me. It was a beautiful book, well, nicely bound, color, and I realized when I started reading it that it was maybe the only copy of that book so far, that one of the few, that he was a self-publisher. I mean, you can go to Amazon and you pay them enough money, you can become a book publisher. There is no gatekeeper like at Harper and Row or some of the other big publishing houses who determine what they're going to publish and distribute to you and tell you that it has meaning and it has value. that anything of no value can be published almost as easily by avoiding this gatekeeper, in many cases, no longer exists. The first thing I wanted to discuss about this is the invention of the electronic newspaper, to say how it happened to come up. Have you ever heard of the vertical blanking interval? Does that mean anything to any of you? Any person in this room? Anybody? The vertical blanking interval? Well, the vertical blanking interval had a lot to do with the invention of the electronic newspaper. I had a great teacher at the University of Missouri when I was working on my PhD, and this goes back into the mid-1950s. It's a long time ago, but he had written a book, and with others, on the international press. And we study very little about that in journalism schools today, but he sort of pioneered in this, and examining the press in other countries and comparing those newspapers and television stations to the United States. And he sent us to the library to read about other countries. His name was John C. Merrill. He'd written many books. He's now deceased. And when I was there, I picked up the BBC magazine. The British Broadcasting Corporation turned out a magazine once a month. And this magazine began to talk about an experimentation in the electronic newspaper. It was called CFAX, C-E-E-F-A-X. Not sure exactly why they used that particular terminology, but the way this occurred was that the president of the British Broadcasting Corporation was watching BBC programming one day with the chief engineer of British Broadcasting Corporation in the same room, and he looked at a program that they were running. It was a dramatic program, and he said, you know, it's too bad that people who are hard of hearing, who are deaf, cannot see this wonderful program, cannot know what's going on in this wonderful program, because they can't hear what the people on the screen are saying. And I wonder if anybody has ever thought about doing something about that. And the chief engineer said, hey, I'll look into that. Maybe I could do something about it. Within 1 year, the chief engineer had discovered a way, and this was back in the early 50s, I think, had discovered a way of putting print on the television screen. Now, while the regular program is going on, you know how you click on the thing very easily. Now it says captions, no captions, or captions off if you just can't even understand the accent or something like that. There was nothing like that there. And he did it by going to what is called the vertical blanking interval. The vertical, you know, all that we see on a television screen are lines, you know, a certain number of lines, like 450 lines. It depends on, now they use pixels, but in those days they used lines for transmitting the picture onto television screens. And this vertical blanking interval, in those days of early television, the screen started drifting down. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It doesn't happen on modern television sets, but the screen starts drifting down, and you see half of two different screens and so on. And the blanking vertical interval keeps that from happening. It keeps the screen straight. It gives commands. It doesn't have any picture on it, but it simply gives commands to the television set. So he used the vertical blanking interval, it may have been line number 425 if I remember correctly, to give signals, to embed signals on this one line that wasn't going to be seen as part of the picture to deliver print. And that was the beginning of the electronic newspaper. And BBC said from that, well, maybe we could produce a newspaper, not only captions for a particular program, but if we have special announcements to the viewers, or special announcements on what upcoming programming, we could use that vertical blanking interval for that also. and fill the whole screen full of print. And that was just the beginning of the electronic newspapers we know it today. The New York Times and almost every daily newspaper has an electronic newspaper of some sort. The other thing that I remember about Tampa especially, I was invited one time to speak to a convention here of the it was called the Classified Advertising Managers of the United States, the National Association of Classified Advertising Directors. And you all know what classified advertising is, right, don't you? Back of the paper, these little ads that people can advertise beds for sale or scooters or whatever. But that was the bread and butter of almost every daily newspaper in the country in those days. You would go back to the classified advertising and there would be 10 or 15 pages. I'm not exaggerating, 10 or 15 pages of classified advertising, and that brought in much of the income to the daily newspaper. And so the classified advertising manager played a big role in the daily newspaper, and the convention was here in Tampa. So an advertising teacher at the University of Florida, who was a member of that association, invited me to speak to these people gathered here in Tampa, a tall building, I can't remember which one it is now. But so I started describing the BBC newspaper, CFAX, and the electronic newspaper, what the electronic newspaper would be, and and I said, and actually I believe that classified advertising will be the first thing to go when this newspaper gets off the ground, because it'll be so easy for people to retrieve classified advertising that way instead of going to a newspaper that you have all this wasted paper and everything else on. And they thought it was so funny. And they thought I was like some worm that had come out from the wall, almost some unrealistic thing. After all, this is how they earn their livelihood. This was one of the biggest sources of income for newspapers, and this jerk from the University of Florida was getting up and saying that the classified advertising was going to be the first thing to go once the electronic newspaper got off the ground. And for years after, I would meet these guys, because it took a long time, and it's still taking a long time for the newspaper, the internet newspaper, to get off the ground. And people say, "That's Ralph. Ralph says classified advertising is going to disappear." Ha ha ha! You know, they really made a lot of fun of me, and it was sort of funny because I knew that something was going to happen. It reminded me of when USA Today. This happened before I think any of you were born, but USA Today was designed by the Gannett newspapers. And it was the brainchild of Alan H. Newharth, the publisher, who thought, look, we have room in this country for a national newspaper. There was no real national newspaper of national distribution. I mean, there were papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that distributed nationally, but nothing that was meeting a deadline and could be distributed in any town or city in the country. And so they worked for several years on it, and that was a source of humor for many of the people, journalists throughout the country, especially editors. I remember going to a convention once in Florida of newspaper editors, and they were laughing at what Newharth was designing. He hadn't seen it yet, of USA Today, and he said, look, he's got this funny box. Look, it's a funny box. It looks like a bank of some kind. He's going to put that up everywhere. He said, one guy told me, I give it 1 year, that paper will go broke. It's not going anywhere. Nobody wants to read a national newspaper. Of course, and Al Newharth told me one time that he thought it was funny himself, that they thought it was funny, because he said, we know it's going to be a success. We have researched this for 2 years before we even started on this project, and we know it's going to be a success. And it was a success, a big success, and it's still circulating these many years later. So this is the story of the electronic newspaper. I think the electronic newspaper is something, though, that hasn't become a success. And hopefully maybe some of you will find the time, or you'll get interested in the electronic newspaper, because in a sense it hasn't gotten off the ground, I think, because it hasn't discovered how to embed advertising into the newspaper itself. I think people want advertising, you know. Some people may find it annoying, but actually people actually want the daily newspaper for its advertising content, because advertising actually is news in many cases. For people who want certain items, advertising is news. And no one has ever, to my knowledge, has ever just figured a good way of putting advertising as news in an electronic newspaper, and thus relatively few people, I think, even use the electronic newspaper. The other thing about the electronic newspaper that is interesting is that where it has displaced or replaced the daily newspaper, there's been no research, no real research from anybody that I know of on what happens to a town when that happens. My daughter lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is a major university town. It's a home of the University of Michigan. It's a very sophisticated town, pretty much the size, a little bit bigger than Gainesville, close to Detroit. And the paper there is a Newhouse newspaper. The Ann Arbor News is owned by Newhouse. And the Newhouse decided 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, just to eliminate the daily newspaper and replace it with an electronic newspaper. They do have an electronic newspaper. Almost nobody reads that electronic newspaper, and what was once a sophisticated town, it still is, but there is no source of information except blogs by various people and other people who have become their own editors, rather than looking for a gatekeeper who can really make the proper decisions about news and what news and photography really is. And to my knowledge, and I think I mentioned this to Professor Garcia last night, to my knowledge, no PhD student, and we have thousands of them in communications throughout this country, has ever gone into a city like Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I think they also stopped the newspaper in New Orleans. It was a Newhouse newspaper as well, the Daily, and say, what happens to a city when there is actually the death of the print newspaper and it is not replaced with an equivalent electronic newspaper? And if anybody can ever tell me that somebody has worked on this, let me know. I wouldn't expect you to, but I would say somewhere around I would read about it. That has never been researched, with all the PhD dissertations that are ground out every year, some about important subjects and some about nonsensical subjects. No one has really figured out a way or thought about going into deciding what happens when there is no longer a newspaper in this particular city. And so that's a roundup of just introductory comments about the electronic newspaper, how it began, how it exists today, and I'd like to open it to questions that you might have, anything having to do, because that's been a favorite subject of mine for many, many years. Have any questions? Yes.
So you mentioned advertising not being properly integrated into electronic newspapers. How do you think that should be done?
Yeah, I think it ought to be done by, if I were doing it, I would have the electronic newspaper. Incidentally, I digress for 1 minute. One problem with the electronic newspaper is it's not very readable. Because when people go to an electronic newspaper, they want the latest news. They want to know the latest news. And most newspapers that do have electronic newspapers as well as their print edition actually print one, newspaper. They set it up, let's to call it 12:15 a.m., okay? And the New York Times does this. They set it up for, it goes on the air, goes on your, available to you as a subscriber, if you subscribe to it, at 12:15 a.m. And it stays that way until 12:15 the next morning. And once you can't do that, a paper newspaper, that's a paper newspaper, of course. It's transfixed. But an electronic newspaper, if you go into it, you want to know what the latest news is. You don't want to know what happened 12 hours ago or 15 hours ago, and that's what you're getting with most newspapers. But the same token, if you go into a newspaper, you would like to find advertising, I think. I think people want advertising. I know it sounds crazy, but I think people do really want advertising. Advertising is news for an awful lot of people. And it's the bread and butter of a regular newspaper. So what I would do is I would start an electronic newspaper that is changed constantly. There's one in Israel that I follow because I'm very interested in what happens in Israel. That's called Yediot Achronot. And they do an English language version. If you ever want to go into it, you can see it. They do an English language version of that newspaper. You just look up Yediot. They just go by the first word, which means news in Hebrew, and Achronot means latest. So the name of the newspaper is Latest News for that print edition as well. And this electronic paper is there, but they're updating it every hour. Every single hour, you can go into Yediot Achronot on the web, and you see what has happened of importance in Israel, let's say, during the last hour. And this is a model, I think, of what the electronic newspaper ought to do. They're not doing anything decent in advertising. But what I would do is update the paper every hour, on the hour, and then I would have a sidebar right next to it. Not on a separate page, but next to it with headings. Department store ads, grocery stores, whatever divisions you want to do as headings for different stores in your community. And a lot of people do shopping in places like Gainesville, perhaps Tampa, to department stores. And the advantage of that over Amazon, let's say, which they are competing with, is that you can go and try on stuff and you can see stuff. And actually, you could go to, let's say, department stores, and the next screen would write up and it would give every department store and the shopping centers here in Tampa. And then you'd go to that, let's say, Home Depot, for example. You wanted something like that. And Home Depot could have an unlimited amount of pages. I mean, if they were willing to pay for it, they could have 10 or 15 pages giving sale items. I think it's important for that kind of advertising would be sale items that wouldn't be necessarily available on the web anywhere else, but would be available for readers and shoppers in this town. To my knowledge, no one has ever tried doing that, and I think it would be a good source of income. Yes?
I read in an article that you said one of the reasons why newspapers were going to die is because they're a wasteful means of distribution.
Because they're what?
A wasteful means of distribution. Do you think that the way media is distributed today, is there any sort of wasteful distribution today? Well,
I think, yeah, I said that because truthfully, that is a factor in it alone. Newspapers, let's go to the New York Times, for example. I mean, I give the worst example in terms of size because does anybody have any idea how many trees have to be cut down to provide one day's worth, one Sunday New York Times? I mean, they're talking about everything in the New York Times, but how many trees really have to be chopped down and ground up I mean, in your imagination, just think wildly, think big. How many trees have to be chopped up to provide that? Anybody got a guess, a rough guess?
50,000?
What?
50,000?
It takes 100,000 trees have to be cut down to provide the paper, to be ground up to provide the paper. The New York Times is in the forest business. They have to own huge forests in Canada. And this is true to a certain extent about it. So not only that, but then they have to, of course, grind it up, add acid to it, whatever to do to make the paper, an expensive process. Then it has to be shipped down in huge rolls to Tampa or wherever, you know, no paper factory right next to Tampa, I don't believe. And it has to be transported. And then the newspaper itself, the distribution of the newspaper is incredible. You have to find somebody who could drive it around, waste gas to do it. And then when the paper is read, it then goes into the waste can in the junk pile and has to be filled